Hello everyone, this is Darcinovia here, once again with another review on a Gundam series. This one is Zeta Gundam, my favorite Gundam series in the entire franchise, and one of my favorite animes of all time. Now, Zeta Gundam, unfortunately, was released when Gundam's, short, popularity in the early 2000s had passed. The original series, Mobile Suit Gundam, wasn't a success like Gundam Wing and G Gundam were. And Zeta Gundam, unlike its predecessors, did not air on TV. So most people who watch Zeta Gundam either watch the bootlegs back in the early 2000s or fan subs. And not many people watched it, unfortunately, compared to other series. And not to mention, this was before streaming services existed. So, Zeta Gundam, unless you are a hardcore Gundam fan, was not seen by that many people, unfortunately. I saw Zeta Gundam before it came out on DVD in the West. And this review is going to be based on the Japanese version of the show. So the English dub, the only thing I'm going to say, it sucks. Stick to the sub. This isn't like Mobile Suit Gundam where the dub is actually good. The dub is shit. Oh my god, I'm not even good. The less we talk about the awful dub of Zeta Gundam, the better. Zeta Gundam takes place 7 years after the events of the original series. In the year 0087, the Titans took over the Federation and essentially turned the Earth Federation to a fascist, state. So, a anti-Titans force arose called the AU. And our protagonist, Kamyu Bidan, unlike Amuro Ray, already knows how to pilot a mobile suit and already has a political ideology already. So unlike Amuro, Kamyu is far more informed. And in my opinion, I think Kamyu is far more relatable than Amuro. In my opinion, I'm talking about in the current political environment, watching Zeta Gundam now, I could agree with many of Kamyu's points, about the Federation and the Titans. I think Kamyu is a pretty good character. His character development throughout the series, he does get more understanding, and he becomes less of an asshole. My first viewing of Zeta Gundam, I couldn't stand Kamyu. I thought he was an annoying little bitch. But my second and third and fourth viewing, I understood where Kamyu was coming from more. For me, in order to understand Kamyu as a character fully, I feel like you have to watch Zeta Gundam multiple times. There's other characters, too, that are introduced. I won't talk about them too much, considering I don't have an hour. And I think people should watch the series themselves to know what the characters are. I think the side characters are great. I think Emma, I think, is a great, character. What little time we see her. And the returning characters, like Amuro, despite only appearing in, like, a handful of episodes, has more character development than the entire Gundam Seed cast in 100 episodes. Char, who goes by the name of Quattro, is great in here. And in order to understand Char's counterattack, this is perhaps the most important chapter in Char's character arc. Because there's people out there that still don't understand Char and think that Char just went crazy and for no damn reason. To get more context, you gotta watch Zeta Gundam, because watching Mobile Suit Gundam and watching Char's counterattack is not going to be enough. And I'll discuss Char's character more when I eventually review the movie Char's Counterattack. I think the villains in Zeta Gundam are great. You know, just like the original series, you have memorable villains. And I think they're pretty cool. Yazan is a pretty badass character, just like, Rumble and the Black Tri-Stars before him. In fact, I actually think the villains in this series are actually better than the original. I think the Titans have lots of memorable villains. And there's even some gray area regarding the AU and the Titans. Yeah, not everybody in the Titans are a bunch of fascist bastards. Well, Jared is a fucking idiot. I don't like Jared. I'm glad his death in the end of the series was probably the most satisfying moment in all of Gundam. Though there are some members of the Titans I do think are more sympathetic. Like, I think Sarah is sympathetic to some extent. You understand why she's loyal to Shirako, even though Shirako is a bastard, also a great villain. Despite appearing sparingly throughout the series, his presence is constantly felt, and every time he's, featured in this series, you could tell this guy means business. I think Shirako is one of the best Gundam villains ever. Though, I do think he doesn't come close to Char, in my opinion. But I do think his ideas are interesting. I'm not going to say any more. I feel like you should watch the series yourself. Haman Khan, which is perhaps one of the best villains in Gundam history, and probably one of the best female villains of all time, or women would be better. She's introduced through this series, and the little amount of time she's featured in here, says a lot about her character. Though, unfortunately, you have to watch Double Zeta if you want to get closure on her character. I could say more about the characters, but I think the cast are well, developed. They're likable. You're bound to have a favorite character by, the end of this series, though don't expect most of them to survive. I mean, depending on the version you go by, Camille kind of gets mind fried by the end of the final episode. And I do not acknowledge the new translation film trilogy. It's a cash grab. So, yeah. The characters are likable. Now, other aspects of Zeta Gundam that I think have stood out. I think the animation is pretty good. The original series, you could tell there wasn't much of a budget with that show, and there were a lot of animation errors in the original series, and not to mention a lot of stock footage, which is understandable considering, the animation, budget they had and how the show had low ratings. Zeta Gundam doesn't have nearly as much stock footage as the original series. And not to mention, unlike the original series, Zeta Gundam looks like an anime that came out in the 80s. The animation style, looks like from the era that it came out in. Even though it looks drastically different from the original, it isn't so different that it feels like it's part of a different universe. This still looks like it takes place in the Universal Century. The mech designs, there's more than one mech designer, and I feel like these designs, I think, are far superior to the original series designs. I know it's a preference. Some people prefer the simpler cartoony designs of the original. I actually prefer the more complex designs. I feel like the mobile suits stand out more. Every time a mobile suit is introduced in this series, you know what they are, and they're not just, hey, let's introduce this new mobile suit that gets destroyed by the Gundam in one hit in one episode, and you barely forget it even existed. I'm talking about you, Zoc. This series doesn't have forgettable mobile suits like the original series did. Even though the original series does have some of the most memorable mech in anime, Zeta Gundam, in my opinion, I feel like are more memorable. And I feel like the Gundam is one of the most iconic Gundams in the entire franchise. When people think of Gundam, they think of the RX-78, the Zeta Gundam. If you're in North America, the Wing Gundam. The Zeta Gundam is one of the best Gundam designs ever. And could you believe that the Zeta Gundam we ultimately got wasn't the first concept for Zeta Gundam? The Psycho Gundam and the Helteraka were concepts for the Zeta Gundam. Glad they didn't go with those ideas. I love the Hirakashiki. It's one of my favorite non-Gundam designs and possibly my second favorite Char, mobile suit, but I just don't think it looks like a Gundam enough. Not to mention the Zeta Gundam, before, transformable mobile suits were commonplace, the Zeta Gundam was pretty unique amongst, Gundams. There weren't that many of them that transformed like the Zeta Gundam did. But now, since many series afterwards, it's become commonplace. The Zeta Gundam's no longer unique. But in my opinion, unlike those Gundams, I feel like its design still is the best of all of them. Then again, this is personal bias considering the Zeta Gundam is my favorite Gundam ever. And now for the soundtrack. Like any anime, the soundtrack I feel like could make or break the experience. I'm not saying it's the most important thing, but having a bad soundtrack can hurt the viewing experience. And Zeta Gundam's soundtrack is some of the best ever in Gundam. I mean, my god, there's such memorable themes. If you hear those themes, I'm not going to get my channel taken down, so I won't play them. But just look on them on YouTube, and you'll know after you've seen Zeta Gundam that you're reminded that this theme was played in this scene, and that scene, and this scene, and that scene. Zeta Gundam's music, I think, is better than the original in many ways. In fact, I consider it more memorable than the original. Not the opening theme, obviously, but the BMs are great. Zeta Gundam is probably one of the few Gundam series that I actually have listened to the soundtrack outside the anime. I love the soundtrack for Zeta Gundam. Honestly, I think it's timeless. It's some of the best music in anime history. And the opening and ending themes. Now, for those who own the North American versions, the opening and ending themes were changed due to something with copyrights. I don't know what it is. In my opinion, I think the theme they chose for the North American version doesn't do the openings justice. If you want to know what the songs are, they're easy to find on YouTube. Just type Zeta Gundam opening and you'll easily find, the opening sequences with the songs. And you'll notice exactly what I'm talking about, how listening to the American version and then the Japanese version, it just is not the same. Though, I don't think it's terrible. I do think the opening sequence is great. It's classic 80s style opening sequence. Yeah. Now, for my rating of this show, since this is going to be biased for obvious reasons, this is a classic. I would give this series a classic rating. One of the best animes of all time. My favorite Gundam series. And if you haven't seen Zeta Gundam yet, you should. You don't need to watch the original series to watch Zeta Gundam. Now, next time I talk about Gundam, I will be talking about the sequel to Zeta Gundam, Double Zeta. May we live long and prosper, and see you guys next time with another video. Later.